transform the world of journalism? Is AI already dictating all the information that we consume?
AI, artificial intelligence, and in particular generative artificial intelligence, are not dictating journalism. They are useful tools among many that journalists have. So I think probably some of the most productive use of AI for journalism right now are summarizing documents.
Hello and welcome to Technocracy. I am Heena Goswami, editorial consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. We all know that media is the fourth pillar of our democracy. By providing information and acting as a watchdog, it holds other pillars, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, accountable for its actions. But like all facets of our democratic life, the institution of media is also being transformed by emerging technologies such as AI. Today, AI has the potential to enhance the efficiency, accuracy, and reach of journalism. Through automated reporting, AI can generate news articles on routine topics such as sports scores, financial reports, and weather updates. This allows journalists to focus more on complex and investigative stories. AI tools can analyze large data sets quickly, uncovering trends and insights that might be missed by human analysts. AI helps news organizations deliver personalized content to readers based on their interest and reading habits, improving reader engagement and satisfaction. Further, AI can assist in fact-checking by quickly cross-referencing information against reliable sources. AI-powered translation tools can make news content accessible to a global audience by translating articles into multiple languages in real time. Advanced large language models also have revolutionized content creation, driving costs down by a staggering 99.96%. However, the thing to remember is that while there are many positive use cases of AI in the newsroom, AI also presents new challenges and ethical consideration for the industry. Firstly, as journalist Karen Howe puts it, Gen AI tools are not meant to be search engines. They are not meant to be factually accurate. So there are risks there in terms of how much one can rely on that information. Jonathan Wright, head of AI for public services at the Alan Turing Institute, also pointed out that hallucinations, where an AI model makes things up, are a real concern. And as yet, firms don't have a way of systematically guaranteeing that AI models will never hallucinate, apart from human oversight. Even the integration of tools into our phones and laptops that aim to provide a quick summary of news may not be most accurate. For example, early this year, Apple suspended an AI feature that drew criticism and complaints for making repeated mistakes in the summaries of news headlines. Also, the companies behind the AI tools most used and recommended by journalists are insufficiently transparent about their ownership, finances, and other critical data, according to a report published by the Media and Journalism Research Center. Also, an overwhelming majority of owners are headquartered in the Europe or the US. So if more of the data used to build and train these AI tools come from Western sources, this has clear implications for the global South journalists using these tools. Even the driving down of cost, while helping make information more accessible, may not always be in favor of journalists as it will drive them out of jobs. Reports earlier authored by journalists may now simply be automated. Added to this is also the threat of misinformation and disinformation. Last year, when over 50 countries held elections, Bad actors ramped up their disinformation campaigns with fake images, fake videos, and fake audios generated with the use of artificial intelligence tools. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights pointed out that AI based algorithms often dictate what we see, shaping our opinions and perceptions of reality. Politicians use AI to weaponize disinformation and advance their own agendas. States are using AI tools to monitor journalists and their sources online, violating their right to privacy. This has a chilling effect on media workers everywhere, and female journalists are being disproportionately targeted, he said. Lastly, there's also the battle of copyright between big tech companies and news organizations that remains unresolved. Whether it be the New York Times complaint that Microsoft and OpenAI are using the Times content without payment to create products that substitute for the Times and steal audience away from it. Or closer home, ANI alleging that OpenAI used ANI's copyrighted news content without permission to train its AI model ChatGPT. These battles haven't been satisfactorily resolved yet. Today's political reality remains that state harass, detain, torture, and even kill media workers simply for doing their job. And in some conflict zone, warring parties restrict or deny access to journalists. In such an environment, AI is both a boon and a bane for the world of journalism. What is required, though, is continued human oversight. Journalists need to use human judgment before and during AI use, and media concentration laws, that is, legislation around ownership of mass media outlets, must also be updated to reflect the power of AI and tech platforms and promote a diverse media landscape that secures space for independent journalism. To understand better how AI and digital proliferation of news has transformed the world of journalism, today we are joined by Professor Clay Calvert. Professor Calvert is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Professor Emeritus, Brecker Eminent Scholar of Mass Communication Emeritus, and former director of the Marion B. Breckner First Amendment Project in the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communication, specializing in First Amendment law. How has AI transformed the world of journalism? Is AI already dictating all the information that we consume? What has been the transformation been like up to this point? And what more do you think we are going to see in the future?
I would say that AI, artificial intelligence, and in particular generative artificial intelligence, are not dictating journalism. They are useful tools among many that journalists have. So I think probably some of the most productive use of AI for journalism right now are summarizing documents. If you feed in a number of different documents, the AI tool can spot patterns, recognize things, and summarize things quickly for journalists. It can also develop possible story ideas by reviewing a bunch of content that's already been out there, that's fed into the model. It looks at that content, or if you fed that content into it, and it can say, hey, look, there's this pattern of crime in a particular area. Maybe we should do a story on that. So it's good at summarizing information quickly for journalists. It's good at probably spotting or identifying potential story ideas. It's a little bit weaker when it comes to actually writing stories. We know we've seen this when they try to do like sports stories, where you basically feed in who scored what when and what the result of the game or the match or the event was at the end. It's a little bit difficult on those things, but it certainly can be very helpful. I would say that because we know that AI can hallucinate, right? Generative artificial intelligence, it would be considered for many journalists a non-credible source. So when we think about journalism, we often think of who are our sources? Who are we interviewing? How credible are they? Do they have a reason to lie? Have they lied in the past? Are they trustworthy? Well, the same thing might be true for ChatGPT. If I were to ask ChatGPT a question and it produced an answer to it, I have to ask myself, is ChatGPT a credible source? And we know, time and time again, that they fabricate information. They get things wrong. Not always, but sometimes they do. And so if you're a journalist, then you have an obligation to corroborate, to double check the information that it produces from an independent source. So, just like any source you would use, you wouldn't rely on one source solely. You'd want to verify the information that something like ChatGPT has produced. So, they're going to be very helpful to journalists. AI is. We've seen a number of companies like the Associated Press, the Wire service, which is all over the world, strike deals with various AI companies that allow the Associated Press, or excuse me, they allow the AI company to use the Associated Press's database of stories, right, to feed into its LLM or its large language models. But on the other hand, then those companies help the Associated Press and other groups out by giving them the tools that they can use to make it more efficient. So efficiency, I think, is one of the key things that we have. Yet I would always say you want to go back and verify that information. So to go back to your question again, it's not dictating journalism, but it's supplementing or complementing and can help journalists out.
My next question is somewhat investigative and a little bit speculative. We do know now that there's a pattern with how the younger generation is consuming information or news, and that is mostly through social media rather than newspaper and TV. But it's also the social media companies, be it X, which has XAI, or Facebook, which is Meta, the larger company that has large language models. So, on one hand, we see that social media has opened the floodgates of misinformation, and second, that these are the companies that have that have the ownership of large language models, and we also know that some of these models are being trained on the information that is being circulated on social media. So, do you think there's a correlation that we need to be worried about? Because are we being thrown into perpetual echo chambers, or like we are being manipulated with the kind of information or words that we are putting on social media?
Sure. So there's a lot in that question that's worth unpacking. One is, how do young people today get their news and their information? And I would say that relying solely on social media is not a good way to do that. We have traditional newspapers. Let's take the United States, where I'm located, and we think about the big newspapers: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, maybe the Los Angeles Times, and there's some other major newspapers. And if I am trying, of a young person, and unfortunately most young people don't read newspapers today, but they probably should. If there's any information, I would try to look at it from two newspaper sources at least. So we typically think in the United States of the New York Times as being more liberal and the Wall Street Journal as being more conservative, right? They each have their own, at least on their op-ed page, their opinions page, a bias that many people sense. So if I were to look at a fact, any piece of information, I would probably want to look at it from what the New York Times said, as well as what the Wall Street Journal said, because they're probably going to have different perspectives. They may be exactly the same because it may be a straight news story, but I'd always want to verify it with another source, just like we were talking about how a journalist wants to verify information produced by ChatGPT with an independent source to make sure it's real and the AI model is not hallucinated in some way. I think young people today need to do the same thing. They need to search out multiple sources for that information. Another part of your question is about the echo chamber or siloed notion that we're fed information that only typically confirms our belief. And that's a very important point. We need to kind of stretch, as it were, because the algorithm is going to feed you information that it believes you want. You've looked at this in the past, it's seen that, the algorithm's seen that, right? And it's going to feed you the exact same type of stuff, which then puts you into this little silo or narrow little track of your filter bubble, your information that you get. So sometimes you have to stretch and try to find other information. And that's one of the benefits of reading I hate to say it, but an old-fashioned print newspaper. When you're reading a print newspaper, you're going to come across stories as you turn the pages that you would say, I wasn't really looking for that story, and there it is. And then I read it and I find something and I say, well, that was an interesting story, even though it wasn't what I wanted. Because on the internet, you're being fed the stories that an algorithm thinks you want, right? But if you're reading a hard copy newspaper and you're flipping through the pages, you're going to come across stories that you never wanted to look at in the first place, but you find out, wow, that's actually an interesting story. And you broaden your horizon in terms of the information to which you're exposed. Uh, I would say that on the other part, yes, to that question, that the models, the LLMs, are only really as good as the quality of the information that are going to be fed into them, right? So, as you were suggesting, if those models have a lot of false information in them, that is going to be likely, I would think, to produce more misinformation or disinformation. And those terms, as we know, are in the United States especially problematic because we think of them being used. Conservatives in the United States think of terms like misinformation, disinformation, because one has intent and the other doesn't, right? Disinformation, I'm intending you to lie to you, basically. Misinformation just happens to be false. Uh, Conservatives see those terms as being used by liberals to remove information that is anti-conservative. On the other hand, liberals tend to believe there's too much false information out there and that the companies should police it more. So ultimately, it comes down to whose responsibility is it? Is it responsibility of Facebook and X and all the social media platforms to police it? Probably not. We have some responsibility too as the audience to question the information that we receive, to look at it skeptically. Too many people, I think, just say, "Oh, there it is. It's on social media. I accept it." They sometimes they repost it, they like it, even though they haven't really read it or thought much about it. So that's troubling. So who really bears that burden? I would say that we are partly responsible for that. Now we've seen models change. So at the beginning of this year, 2025, Facebook changed its model with Mark Zuckerberg, right? It went to a community notes system. A community notes system is one where people post responses generally after something has been posted to clarify it, say it's wrong, explain it. But it's not Meta itself now or Facebook going in and saying this is wrong. So you've got two different models. Should it be one, the company, Facebook, that says, okay, we're going to judge whether this information is good or bad or right or wrong or the truth or false? Or should it be a community system where users online then get to chime in with a large thread after that post with their thoughts about that? So who does the policing? Is it more a community system or is it the company itself? So there are a lot of different ways we can go. Obviously, it's still a problem. I don't think that misinformation or disinformation is something new in the internet era. There have always been campaigns out there, right, to fool the people, to create stories, to fabricate. The problem is with the internet, it comes faster and easier and cheaper for people to do, and the scope of the dissemination is much wider. So we've always had false information. Now it just comes faster and cheaper in a much wider distribution.
There used to be a time where journalists would break stories, and I know that in my countries there were scandals relating to corruption that were broken, that were broken by the media, and it led to downfalls of government or regime change, or like a new party came to power because of that single incident. I mean, multiple factors were played, but the trigger was a certain scandal that came to light because the news was broken by a journalist. There's another pattern that we see today when we open Twitter, where young people are receiving information from. We see that XYZ, owner of a social media company, has interest in some regime, some party, not just in their own country, but in other parts of the world. And then they are putting out stories that perpetuate a certain point of view. In that changing scenario, where whether it's driven by algorithmic bias, and in case of Twitter or in case of certain platforms, we cannot remain sure that it's our engagement that is bringing us the timeline that it has. I'm not a conservative, I'm not anti-immigration, but my timeline is full of that kind of content, because right, that is breaking the internet at the moment. So how do you think, how has the role of journalist evolved in such a scenario? And how do we remain, how do we like how do we ensure that there is a boundary between what is being put out to us as truth, or with multiple perspectives, and what is being forced upon us or being pushed to us with an ulterior motive? Where does the responsibility of journalists in that scenario lies?
Sure. So I think part of what you're getting to is that the owners of media companies may have very diverse interests that are beyond simply journalism, and that sometimes the interests of those owners of media companies may be in selling their own products or making money for themselves in various other domains. In other words, they may conflict with the interests of truth telling that journalists typically have. And journalists, we know, are supposed to come into stories being neutral and unbiased and play a watchdog role on some of those same entities. So that's a problem I think that has always existed, where large businesses that own journalism outlets sometimes have these conflicts of interests. So I think we do have to be skeptical of that and ask ourselves sometimes, why are we being fed these particular stories? Do they align sometimes with the interests of the owner of those media outlets? So let's face it, President Trump owns Truth Social. That is his own little mini platform. And so you're going to get views that are very biased toward him, right? They're going to be pro-Trump on Truth Social. Other platforms, you may get anti-Trump speech, right? And we always have to think about why that may be the case. So I think it is interesting. We have to think about the motives that may be behind stories that we're being fed. So journalists who work for these organizations, and I think that's important. Like, what is we tend to lump everything into the media, uh, and we have legacy media and new media, but we also have traditional journalism. And I think something we haven't talked about yet is that the traditional journalism was bound by certain ethical principles, not necessarily law, but ethical ones about telling the truth, investigating, like you're talking about, not being afraid to investigate a story that may reflect badly ultimately on the company that you have something to do with, that your business has something to do with, being fair and balanced, not causing harm that's unnecessary. But truth telling, right, and objectivity are the typical things that we think about journalistic obligations. And so it's hard to kind of draw this wall of separation between, here's the owner of my media outlet and they have these interests, and then I'm a journalist working for that media outlet or publishing on it, and how do I make sure that I try to be straightforward and tell the truth in a way that still exists despite the owner's interests in other matters. So it's a tricky issue, and it's existed before the internet, right?
On the one aspect that you brought up of traditional journalists, and I feel like they have more voice because of internet, because of AI tools. They are able to put their content out there, but also they are facing now more threats because their work is out there. And that has happened in several cases in India, where we feel sort of our voices are drowning because there's echo of big media houses pushing certain views, but then there are small voices doing investigative journalism, and that has caused bodily harms, death of their families. But yes, I wish everyone goes back to some of the basics and the ethics of journalists that truly brought them to this job that they are doing.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is the smaller news organizations, and they are popping up in the United States too, to fill these what we call news deserts. In other words, there are areas where we don't have many big mainstream news organizations anymore, and so sometimes universities are doing that. I was at the University of Florida, And so within our Department of Journalism, we have something called Fresh Take Florida, which is really student journalists producing content under the guidance of faculty members who are actually veteran journalists. They've retired from those jobs. And then those stories that they write then are disseminated and picked up by larger newspapers. So we're increasingly relying on smaller news organizations, independent ones, to kind of fill those holes and to do some of that important investigative work that may not be done. And I agree, the threats, right, whether it's a physical threat or something else, right, about job security, that journalists take when they investigate a story that may conflict with the interests of the government or the owners of the large news entities. Those are real risks, but it's a vitally important role. We think of it in the United States as journalists play what we call a watchdog role, right? They play a watchdog role on the government. They're there to expose abuses of power. And sometimes, including in the United States, we see political figures try to censor or silence the news media that they don't agree with because they don't like the story or the viewpoint. And that's very dangerous, of course, because then you get a government trying to control all of these voices so that they all kind of sing on the same page and they all support the government. And that's not the role of journalism. It's to expose the truth. And if the government's doing something wrong, then that's the role of the journalist to expose it in that watchdog role, right? They're watching over it. They're playing a checking role on abuses of the government.
There's also one question that has emerged recently, and that is of copyright battles that have been happening between big tech companies and legacy media houses. Uh, do you think these issues would be resolved anytime soon? And what should be the way forward?
Sure. So on the copyright issue, are we talking particularly about the generative AI and what's
Yes,
being fed into large language
yes,
models? Is that
yes.
correct? So that's a huge issue in the United States right now. We saw a settlement last week between a group of book authors and Anthropic, which is one of the big generative AI companies, where the book authors' content is being fed into the large language models. In this particular case, with the settlement that came down for 1.5 billion last Friday, the problem for Anthropic was that it had taken pirated copies of the books. It had not bought them themselves. It had gone to sources that had illegally obtained the books of these authors. And then it used those illegally obtained copies to help train its large language models. And so that was the nature of that settlement. In that same case, however, the judge said that large language models themselves can be trained on other people's content because what you're doing is it's transformative. We call it a transformative use. Because as we know, and trust me, I'm not an expert on this, but large language models, right? We're simply predicting what comes next. Every word has a vector that leads off of it, where we figure out what is the most likely word to come next out of that, or if this word is used, then what's the next one that's most likely? It's when I'm typing online and it fills in the rest of the word at the most simplified version for it. So when a story or book or a news story, let's say it's an Associated Press news story, or a book is fed into it, or a magazine or entire newspaper, right? The notion that it's a transformative use in training large language models is the large language model is simply learning to predict what comes next. After I say this word, what's going to be the next word or the word most likely to pop up. And so, in that sense, then, it is not a copyright violation. That's the transformative use. It's a different use. The problem is when the large language model spits out a story that reads almost exactly like the story that a journalist wrote. And that's part of the New York Times's case. The New York Times has said that no, the OpenAI, when you use some of the things that come out, are exactly like what we said. Now, there's a dispute about how they got that result. Did the New York Times somehow type in a question again and again and again until it manipulated it to get the response? Then here's our story. Or does that happen? To the extent, again, that the LLM produces the exact same story or a duplication or something that's a market substitute for it, that's problematic, right? We want to incentivize authors to create new knowledge. And I think that's one of the issues that has not been talked about enough is that LLMs rely on existing knowledge, right? They rely on the information that's being fed into them. Somebody has already produced something, they've been paid for it, and now the LLM is using that information. It's pureeing it, right? It's taking it, it's synthesizing, and there it is. Now we've got that information. But it doesn't really create new information or new facts uh, by itself, right? It can give you an answer to something, but its answer is going to rely on what's already been fed into that. So we need to incentivize people to create new knowledge in new knowledge realms because otherwise, like, what's the point? I write a textbook, okay? So I don't own the copyright. McGraw-Hill, a publisher, owns the copyright. But there are, let's say, 10 textbooks in my area of First Amendment media law for undergraduate students. Let's say they're 10, hypothetically. And let's say that a large language model is fed all 10 of these textbooks and it reads them all. I suspect that the large language model, based upon the 10 textbooks and knowing that they probably overlap in many ways, could create its own textbook that is very similar to it and probably has some errors. It'll hallucinate, but it generally gets it right. The question becomes, what's the incentive then for anybody else to write a textbook with new knowledge in it and new facts and to put new cases and new statutes and new laws into that? You have to incentivize authors to create original works, right? And that's what copyright law is really about. If I write a story and I'm paid for it, good. Now I've been paid, right? I'm happy. But if somebody then takes my story and reproduces it for free, that's a copyright violation. If they don't have a license to do it, if they haven't purchased it. So these issues are going to keep playing out over time. So the Anthropic settlement that happened just a couple of days ago, I believe it's on the 5th of September, with the authors, that dealt with, again, a very limited situation of Anthropic using book copies that had been pirated by others. And it scraped that information and it fed it into that, rather than buying those books for the first time itself.
AI does increase efficiency in the newsroom. What we need to balance it out is with human oversight. And we also need, as news consumers, we need to be aware that AI can hallucinate. Even as journalists, we need to be aware that AI can hallucinate. And as news consumer, we need to verify from 2, 3 sources if we are consuming something off the social media. Other than this, do you think there are other challenges associated with AI being used by journalists that you foresee? And is there a need to balance them out? Are there precautions in your mind that one needs to keep in mind while using AI?
Sure. I mean, I think for the journalists, it's really slow down and understand how the large language model that you are using actually works. Whether it's summarizing that document for you, trying to spot patterns of information, excuse me, trying to spot patterns that lurk within information that are fed into it, understanding the potential, as you said, that it may hallucinate and produce false information. I mean, I think that's really essential. And I guess the danger of journalists just becoming lazy and relying on it. We've seen this. It's not just journalists, it's attorneys. We've seen multiple cases in the United States where attorneys or their experts have filed briefs with courts. And it turns out that they've relied on AI models that have generated fabricated cases, opinions from courts that don't even exist, or they've gotten the outcome of the case wrong. And these attorneys are sanctioned by it. So, journalists are not members of a legal system. So it can't be that they're fined or disbarred or whatever it is. But attorneys do this now, and it's becoming regular in the United States, unfortunately. And we've known this for several years now when the first instances popped up, where journalists relied on it. And it's important because we think about the main databases that we use to gather information. So we have LexisNexis or Academic Universe, was one of the big ones in the United States, or Nexus Uni now it's called. And that's a database of information. It's fed all of the cases. And if I type in, a word or a phrase, it's going to give me the cases that have that in it, right? But that's not really how large language models necessarily work. So I think there is a problem of reliance, that it becomes quick and easy, and that both journalists and attorneys and others in other professions, whatever it is, should not necessarily trust it. It's one source among many, and you have a duty to investigate the information that it produces. So I think you gave a nice synthesis of the things we've been talking about there when you started out. That was very good. I think that captured pretty much everything.
I must say that despite the vast cultural, socio-political, infrastructure-related differences we might have, in India as well, it is the lawyers, the attorneys who have been sort of using ChatGPT and, giving it evidence of cases or court judgments that are not there, and using hallucinated ChatGPT results to prove their point. And I mean, this is more than journalists; it's the attorneys who have been, using that without realizing the many mistakes that AI models do tend to make.
It's exactly what we're having in the United States, really. It's the same thing. And then the other party, because so one party submits this brief with these fabricated, cases or statutes in it. The other side, of course, is going to look them up. They're going to say, well, we got to look at these cases. And then they realize they don't exist. Then that other party then files a motion with the judge and says, Your Honor, these cases don't exist. And so, yes, it's not just journalists, it's attorneys, and I can imagine in other fields too. And so that's a danger, that we become lazy. I think the big picture too, if we step back, is that we don't have to think for ourselves anymore, and that's really problematic. I was reading about another use, again, not journalists, but college students, or students who are applying to college. They will use ChatGPT and other tools, generative AI tools, to write their personal essays for them. So when you apply to college, one of the most important things, besides your scores and your grade point average, is your personal essay, which should be you telling something about yourself. And to the extent now that we have high school students in the United States who rely on this artificial intelligence tool to write their essays to describe who they are for them, that's really fraudulent. People need to be able to think for themselves. And so I do see that danger where eventually people won't have logic skills left. They won't be able to get to that result. It's the same thing when Google first came out. Now we say, just Google it. Just Google it. There's your answer, right? Same type of thing. So I think there are dangers all the way around.
Also, now nobody cares for a PhD because you can just Google everything and know things from reels and videos and TikToks.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And now the whole process of writing your dissertation, right, or your thesis, whatever it is, to get that master's degree or your PhD, right, which traditionally has been a years long process. You do your own research. This has changed the entire nature of that process. But going through those steps as a graduate student is really vital in terms of your learning, your ability to write. You go through a committee. There are 4 or 5 people in your committee. And now, oh, well, just type it in. There's the answer. Are we going to become dumber, right, as a society collectively because we can't think anymore?
Thank you so
All right,
much
thank you.
thank you for this conversation. Thank you so
All right,
much.
take care.
If you enjoyed watching this episode of Technocracy, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more AI related conversation, you can also watch IGPP Expert Talks AI Special Series.